120 years ago, in Paris, France, a political scandal erupted that rocked the nation to its core. The affair began with the conviction for treason of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a young French artillery officer of Alsatian Jewish descent. Sentenced to life imprisonment for allegedly having communicated French military secrets to officials in the Parisian German embassy, Dreyfus was sent to the penal colony at Devil's Island in French Guiana, where he spent almost 5 years. With all of the charges being false and wide-ranging anti-Semitic tactics being used at his trial, Dreyfus's case has become one of the most striking examples of a miscarriage of justice in the modern world. While this injustice was being perpetrated, another Jew, a journalist from Austria, happened to be sitting in the courtroom covering the trial. This Jew, Theodor Herzl, an assimilated man who chose to live in Paris due to its reputation for human rights, stemming from the cries of the French Revolution of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, had his world turned upside down. He remarked that if France, bastion of emancipation, progress, and universal socialism, can get caught up in a maelstrom of anti-Semitism and let the Parisian crowd chant, "Kill the Jews," where can they be safe once again if not in their own country? Assimilation does not solve the problem because the Gentile world would not allow it, as the Dreyfus affair has so clearly demonstrated. Herzl realized that assimilation into a modern pluralistic society could not be enough. Judaism, and the embrace of it in a safe environment, in a state of its own, was, in his mind, the central component to the continued survival of the Jewish people. It was at this moment that Herzl helped found the modern-day political Zionist movement. Now, taking a step back, it is important to remember that Zionism did not begin with Herzl. We read time and again in our Bible, in rabbinic writings, and even in our prayer books of a desire to return to the land of our forefathers from which we had been expelled by the Romans following the destruction of the Second Temple and the failed Bar Kokhba revolt. The psalmist exclaims, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its cunning. For we are never to forget Jerusalem in the land of Israel. On Passover, as we end our Seder, the Haggadah proclaims, L'shana haba'ah b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. For even if we are not in Jerusalem next year, the Haggadah reminds us that we should always yearn for a connection to it, and even when we pray in our own temple, there is a constant reminder of the land of Israel. For just like Jews all over the world, as we pray, we face the land of Israel, Jerusalem, and the remnants of the Holy Temple. Therefore, Zionism is not new. The end has always been the same, the reestablishment of the Jewish homeland. Herzl just changed the means. He and those that were working with him in those early years of the political Zionist movement used politics and diplomacy, as well as immigration and hard work, to establish the beginnings of a state. Then tragedy struck European Jewry, and the need for a Jewish state was even more evident. Aliyah, or immigration to Israel, picked up following the Second World War, even though there were tremendous obstacles to overcome, and the Jewish state was founded in May of 1948. The dream and the hope of almost 2,000 years had finally come to a reality. Yet this was not the end of the Zionist political enterprise. It has changed and adapted, bringing in Jews by the thousands from the displaced persons camps of Europe to the deserts of Yemen, from Ethiopia to the former Soviet Union. Time and again, it performed the miracle of something from nothing. The Zionist movement has continually changed and adapted to allow for the changing Israeli society it supports and represents, allowing Israel to grow and adapt, allowing its citizens to thrive. Yet now, 120 years after the political Zionist movement was founded in the mind of Herzl in that Parisian courtroom, it, along with the nation it supports, faces a series of existential threats. In his book, My Promised Land, which our book club will be reading and discussing this fall, Israeli writer and journalist Ari Shavit lays out a series of concentric circles of threat that he sees affecting the Jewish state. The first threat, the external circle, is the Islamic circle. Israel is, at its heart, a Jewish state. And this fact alone arouses the animosity of a good many Muslims. The occupation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank amplified this animosity, but it is Israel's very existence as a sovereign, non-Islamic state in a land that is sacred to Islam and surrounded by Islam that creates the inherent tension between the tiny Jewish nation and the vast Islamic world. Now, I want to make sure I am not misunderstood or overgeneralizing. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, which makes up almost 1/4 of the world's population. In fact, according to the State Department, there are more Muslims in the United States alone than Jews in the entire state of Israel. So I want to be clear, not all Muslims share this viewpoint. Many either do not have a view on the issue or do not have overtly negative feelings towards Jews and the Jewish state. Many want to have peace. But there has been a history of conflict between the Muslim world and the Jewish state, starting even before Israel's independence was declared. And Israel has been able, however, to forge strategic alliances with moderate Muslim countries and has created strategic partnerships and fostered mutual interest arrangements in order to avoid turning this regional conflict into a religious one. But with the rise of radical Islam, Israel has been losing some of its allies. Iran is the great threat, but there are other Muslim threats as well, and this leads to the risk of Israel's future. The next circle of threat is the Arab circle. Just as Israel is situated in the middle of the Muslim world, it is also situated in the middle of the Arab world. The Arab national movement tried to prevent the founding of Israel and failed. The Arab nations tried to destroy Israel and failed. As such, the very existence of Israel as a non-Arab nation state in the Middle East is a testimony to the failure of Arab nationalism. So when the Arab nations finally started realizing this reality, some were finally willing to recognize Israel. This realization led to peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. And yet the Arab Spring has changed the status quo. While there is no regional war on the horizon with the Arab world, Israel is facing increased Arab turmoil. As the states of Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon have collapsed, Israel has found itself surrounded by failed states, extremist nations, the al-Qaeda-linked al-Nusra Front in the Syrian part of the Golan Heights, and now the so-called Islamic State is getting closer and closer. The third circle is the Palestinian circle. Underlying this threat is that Israel is perceived by many in the Arab world, and by the Palestinians in particular, as being a settler state founded on the ruins of the indigenous Palestinian population. Time and again, we have seen what this threat can look like, including just recently. This past summer, as many of us were on vacation, at camp, on sabbatical, or in my case, having just moved to a new city to start a new chapter, tragedy struck. 3 Israeli boys, Naftali Frankel, Gilad Sha'er, and Ayal Yifrach, were kidnapped while trying to get home for Shabbat. Having been immediately killed by their captors, the entire state of Israel, and indeed a large portion of the world Jewish community, spent the next 18 days worrying, praying, and hoping for their safe return. In response to the kidnapping, the Israeli security apparatus conducted a large-scale crackdown on Hamas and other militants in the West Bank, which led, according to their own statements, Hamas in Gaza to begin a campaign of launching rockets at Israel's population centers. This was, as I am sure most of you are aware, followed by a 50-day war of both fighting and attrition, with multiple ceasefires declared, each time being violated by Hamas. At this time, thank God, there is a ceasefire in effect, with both sides promising to meet again soon to discuss broader issues such as the disarmament of Hamas and the potential for building an airport and seaport in Gaza. Now, personally, I am convinced that Hamas will refuse to disarm, which will lead Israel to reject the demands of the terror group. This will, unfortunately, in my opinion, lead to more of what we have seen before. And I will, unfortunately, add one more circle of threat, which lies outside the three I have previously mentioned and which Shavit does not address in his book. This is the court of world opinion. Throughout this most recent war, world opinion, both among the media and the masses, was dramatically anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic. In commenting on how the New York Times covered the war, Rabbi Richard Block, president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, remarked, "Its obsessive focus is on Palestinian civilian casualties, especially children, publishing photos of their corpses and little else as if they tell the whole story. The deaths of innocents in wartime are tragic and heartbreaking. They diminish us all. But a newspaper committed to balance and fairness would provide context and perspective. It would show traumatized Israeli children running to shelters, cowering, wetting their beds, and suffering nightmares. It would publish photos and accounts of militants launching rockets from the roofs of mosques, a church, a hotel, alongside schools, refugee shelters, clinics, and hospitals, and of weapons concealed by Hamas in UN facilities. It would substantiate casualty figures from Hamas, which are known to have been falsified in the past before reporting them as fact. It would highlight Hamas's use of civilians as human shields, its urging civilians to ignore Israel's advance warnings to depart so that Gazans would be killed and inflict PR damage on Israel. Such a paper would cover the threats of death that inhibited reporters and journalists from telling the true, full story. Unfortunately, the New York Times is not alone in their sins of misreporting and of using anti-Israeli tactics. Mainstream media outlets question the moral equivalency based on the number of dead alone. Commenting on this, the Wall Street Journal's Bret Stephens wrote, "The real utility of the body count is that it offers reporters and commentators who cite it the chance to ascribe implicit blame to Israel while evading questions about ultimate responsibility for the killing. Questions such as, why is Hamas hiding rockets in UN-run schools, as acknowledged by the UN itself? What does it mean that Hamas has turned Gaza's central hospital into a de facto headquarters, as reported by the Washington Post? And why does Hamas keep rejecting or violating ceasefires agreed to by Israel? These are all important questions that have not been asked by Western media. In fact, what is not reported, as Israeli political commentator Yossi Klein Halevi remarks, is that Gaza's fate could have turned out very differently if the Palestinians had taken advantage of the opening created by the Israeli withdrawal. The notion that Israel's siege left Hamas no choice but to fight is an inversion of chronology. The siege began only in 2007, 2 years after the Israeli pullout, when Hamas violently seized power and intensified rocket fire on Israel. Hamas seeks to end the siege and build a port not to improve Gaza's civilian infrastructure, but its capacity to terrorize. Port Tehran, as one Israeli commentator put it, is a channel for more advanced weaponry. The siege didn't cause the war caused the siege. And it is precisely this perversion of the facts on the ground that has led to an increase in open hatred toward Israel. when the Fourth Estate, when the world media does not do its job, and terrorist groups, politicians, world leaders, the media, and the masses are allowed without being checked to say anything, then the vitriol we have seen coming from communities all over the world becomes more prevalent. Now, just because Israel is under threat does not mean it's time to panic. Israel is still strong defensively, morally, and industrially. Throughout the war, the Iron Dome system saved countless lives and property, and we have to say, thank God it exists and that it works so well. While mistakes were made, extreme efforts were exerted in order to minimize civilian casualties. In fact, while fighting a war with Hamas in Gaza, Israel was still allowing food, water, electricity, and medical supplies to enter the Gaza Strip in order to help out individual Palestinian civilians. Israel has also supplied both medical assistance and services to Palestinian and Syrian civilians who have been victims of military violence. Additionally, Israel is still strong economically. This year, 6 out of 10 companies on the Forbes list of top 10 health tech companies changing the world were Israeli startups. The 3 individuals who shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry last year were all Israelis, and Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem is at the forefront of life-saving stem cell research. In fact, just this past month, an Israeli company tested the world's first flying car. So even with all these threats, Israel is still strong. But what is our role? What should we as Jews in the diaspora, spending this Rosh Hashanah, this new year, together in Fort Worth, Texas, do to support and strengthen the Jewish state? First, it is important to understand that even though we may not always approve of the actions of the Israeli government or its citizens, there is much to be proud of, and I have only mentioned the tip of the iceberg. Therefore, it is time to reframe the conversation on Israel. No more is Israel the underdog that it was before 1967 and the Six-Day War, and no more is Israel the state that faces a direct military threat from all sides. No, it now faces growing Islamic and Arab threats on its borders, while facing the growing concern that the world Jewish community may not be supporting it to the same extent as in the past. Therefore, we need to re-examine how we look at Israel. Rabbi Dr. Daniel Gordis, who is Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem, writes, "Before us now lies an opportunity to have, at long last, a renewed conversation about why the Jews need a state and the values on which it ought to be based." For far too long, 90% of Jewish conversations about Israel have been about Israel's enemies. Eavesdrop at almost any Shabbat table in New York, Los Angeles, Sydney or Melbourne, London or Paris, and the conversation is about the Palestinians or Iran's nuclear ambitions. We discuss ad nauseum how to preserve the Jewish state without ever asking ourselves why it matters in the first place. And this is where we as diaspora Jews need to turn. We need to have the discussion and come to the understanding that there is a need for the Jewish state of Israel. For the contemporary state of Israel is a unique opportunity, unparalleled in all of Jewish history. Israel has the opportunity to build a previously unimaginable society, a combination of the best of Jewish ideals, values, and traditions, combined with the best of modern politics, discourse, and technology. It can be a center, or even the center, of Jewish culture. It can breathe new life into our national language. It can be our assurance that anywhere Jews are oppressed, they have a country to defend them and grant them refuge. And we know this to be true, for just this summer, hundreds of French Jews made Aliyah in the wake of rising European anti-Semitism. We are some of the very few Jews in all of history who have been able to enjoy the existence of an independent Jewish state. Controversies should never cause us to take this for granted, nor cause us to lose our connection to the state. Rather, it is important to be a vocal critic of Israel when the time is right. It is just as important, however, to know how to voice the criticism. Unabashed, naive, unfiltered criticism of Israel is not healthy to the debate, and yes, I do believe that anti-Israel statements by some in the non-Jewish community are often thinly veiled attempts at anti-Semitism without outwardly saying so. So it is up to us as Jews to guide the debate. Disagree with Israel when her actions do not seem to fit our Jewish values, but disagree from a place of love, not animosity. For the Jewish people have always been sustained by three things: by God, by Torah, and by Israel. Our belief in God, as well as our knowledge of Torah, and our yearning to fulfill our yearly cry of next year in Jerusalem, is what has caused our people to flourish, even when we have not had a homeland that we could physically lay claim to. But for the last 66 years, we have had the opportunity to have our own state, our own Jewish state, in our homeland, in Israel. We must not forsake it, nor may we criticize it without remembering our connection to it and its value to not only the Jewish people, but to humanity. Additionally, we need to support Israel in more ways than just changing the conversation. Fight back against anti-Israeli rhetoric and the boycott, divest, and sanction, or BDS movement, through words as well as actions. Support Israeli companies and give tzedakah to Israeli causes. Furthermore, support progressive causes in Israel by joining ARTSA, the Association of Reformed Zionists of America, and by voting for them in the upcoming elections of the World Zionist Organization. Utilize resources put out by AIPAC and J Street, as well as read Israeli newspapers in order to stay current on what is happening in Israel, both with her foreign affairs, but also culturally and politically. And most importantly, we can all show our support for Israel by going there. For those of you in high school, or soon to be in high school, start thinking about taking a trip with Green Family Camp, NIFTY, the Alexander Muss High School in Israel, or any number of other programs that will allow you to not only visit, but to live in and experience Israel. For those of you in college, or just out of college, Birthright is an amazing opportunity to see Israel, and it's free. And for everyone else in this room, if you haven't been to Israel, go. You will fall in love with the Jewish homeland. And for those of you who have been already, go. You will fall in love with her all over again. For Israel truly is the land and state of the Jewish people. She may not be perfect, but it is through our love and support that she will continue to thrive. 66 years after its founding, Israel has returned to its core questions of identity. Can Israel exist as a modern democracy and as a Jewish nation at the same time? And in the Middle East, no less. 120 years after it was launched, Zionism is confronted with its core contradictions. What is the meaning of Zionism, and how should it progress its value of supporting the Jewish state in the changing world of the 21st century? The challenges that Israel faces go well beyond that of occupation and prospects of peace. And it is through the determination of the Israeli people and the support of all world Jewry that Israel will be able to face her challenges head-on and to continue to thrive not only into this new year, but for years and, God willing, centuries ahead. May all of Israel, the land, the state, and all the Jewish people, both within and outside of the physical borders, continue to go from strength to strength, and may Eretz, and Medinat Yisrael Chai, may the people, land, and country of Israel live on. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. Shana Tova.